Welcome back. So let's go ahead and get started with how would we get Tanzu deployed in my environment. As I've said to you earlier, vSphere with Tanzu is actually running on top of vSphere, on top of NSXT. It could, or it might not, depending on what you choose. It could be running on top of vSAN, or you could be providing different storage in your environment. So you already know vSphere. Hopefully you know NSXT. vSphere with Tanzu is running on top of that. How do you get those other components down here at the bottom, the vSphere, the NSXT, how do you get them installed so that you can actually put my Kubernetes platform on top of it? So as you can see on side, it's sitting here on top of this solutions down here. We've got a solution called VMware Cloud Foundation. And what VMware Cloud Foundation does for us is it automatically provisions and sets up for us things like vCenter servers, ESX hosts, the vMotion kernel port, the vSAN replication port, deploys NSXT, sets up my vSAN disk groups. It does all of that for me. vSphere with Tanzu can then be provisioned by VCF right on top of that solution for you, and we could do lifecycle management for you. So it's a way to quickly do it. And if you thought about it, how long would it take you down here? How many days is it going to take you if you're setting up a brand new platform to get your ESX host provisioned, your vCenter server, NSXT, the host prep? All that accomplished is going to typically take you a couple of days. VCF can do that in a couple of hours. Okay, so it's one way that you can get vSphere with Tanzu deployed and stood up. Now, in this class, we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to have you starting with this platform already set up. So the labs are going to give you a working vCenter server. We're going to have NSXT already deployed for you and set up. We're going to obviously have our shared storage set up for you. And then you're going to enable these infrastructure and runtime services inside here, which are the services that comprise vSphere with Tanzu. How are you going to do that? You're going to do it over here using the HTML5 client and simply connecting to the vCenter server. Later, we're going to set up our kubectl over here, and we're going to use kubectl to talk to the API server running inside our Kubernetes platform so we could see how we would do both of those. And that's going to be the labs coming up shortly. So in this picture back here, you're going to have to make a decision, and it's going to have to deal with here networking. Do you want to use NSXT as your networking platform for my pods that are going to be running potentially up here? You don't have to. And that's one of the new features that came available with us when we went to vSphere Update 1. We are giving you, the customer, a choice of saying, do you want to run it on top of a platform that includes NSXT? Obviously, it has costs, but it also has a whole bunch of benefits that come with that if you went down that route. Or do you want to run it without NSXT and simply plug it into your distributed switches? That's a decision you're going to have to make. We're going to go through both of the feature sets of them. And then at the end of this section, you should be able to decide which way you want to go. Now, as you can see inside here, they both will allow me to run the Tanzu Kubernetes grid service. Over when I'm looking at using it with NSXT, this is one of the big features that I get, which we'll explain. we can use the vSphere pod service. That service is not available when we're using distributed switches. They both support networking services. However, this network service over here is using the NSXT load balancer, NATs, etc., even distributed firewall features over here. When we're doing it on the distributed switch, you're going to be setting up an external load balancer to be doing that load balancing, because Kubernetes does have to have the ability to be able to do a load balancer. There's a way that you can do that with the distributed switch. We'll talk some more about that. They both support the storage service. However, we do not support over here the embedded Harbor registry service. And again, all of these we're going to talk about in the upcoming slides. So how does vSphere with Tanzu work? vSphere with Tanzu works by creating a series of control plane VMs. Those control plane VMs are the equivalent to the Kubernetes control plane nodes. So if you think about when we did Kubernetes, we had inside here, we had our 3 control plane VMs, right? These 3 control planes, VMs sitting over here. And then we had a series of worker nodes over here that were deployed in a typical Kubernetes deployment. We're going to do the same thing over here. These 3 control plane VMs that are going to get provision for us, we're going to use the EAM service, which is our ESX agent manager, to actually oversee those 3 VMs, the deployment of them, their ongoing lifecycle management of them, and we're going to let EAM create an agency to actually go do that for us. And you're going to see that in the lab coming up shortly. Because we're running on an ESX cluster, a vSphere cluster, we have DRS turned on. DRS, if your cluster was maybe comprised of, let's say, 6 ESX hosts, we would use DRS to determine which of those 6 ESX hosts should be running these 3 control plane VMs, and he will go ahead and handle anti-affinity rules to make sure that they don't end up on the same host to decrease our blast radius in case we have an ESX host failure. The control plane VMs, just like in Kubernetes, they end up being my API endpoint. They are the things that are running the infrastructure services in the pods to support that platform of the control plane VMs, and the lifecycle management of the control plane VMs. We'll talk about how that occurs across these control plane VMs. This is a little bit more detail about the control plane VMs. Remember, you have 3 of them. They are running all these respective services. Some of those services are going to be running actually as pods on top of that control plane VM. So if we did a kubectl get pods and we had the appropriate authorization, we can actually see all of these pods running on my master node sitting inside here. How do those control plane VMs actually get networked? You know, they're connected. Each of the control plane VMs are going to have 2 NICs in them. So they're going to be multi-homed. They're going to have 1 NIC coming up here to the management network. And then they're going to have a second NIC, which is coming down up here to this new network that we're setting up called the cluster network. Okay, that cluster network is how the control plane VMs talk to each other, as well as how they can actually talk to the pods that are being deployed. These would be my vSphere pods. This topology picture that we're referencing here, I'm going to encourage you when you go in to do the labs, pay attention when you're doing the labs, because you're going to see when you enable the workload platform, he's going to ask you for 2 networks. And these are the 2 networks that he's going to be asking you about. You're going to be choosing the CIDR address to use on that network. So I'm saying here 172.20.10.160. You'll see when you choose this network, you're going to have to fill out those CIDR addresses. As well as when you choose the cluster network down here, you're choosing those addresses here. So the supervisor clusters, what are they? You're going to hear this term mentioned pretty regularly, this thing that's talking about the supervisor cluster. And what the supervisor cluster is, it is the vSphere cluster, series of ESX hosts that we've enabled workload platform on. So in other words, we're turning that vSphere cluster into a special cluster that is capable of running Kubernetes. So when we've given it that indication and we refer to it as, this is my supervisor cluster, you could see down here, I've got a series of ESX hosts. So this is an ESX cluster or a vSphere cluster that I've turned on DRS and HA on. I've told EAM to go off and deploy on that cluster a series of these control plane VMs that are going to act as my master nodes of Kubernetes. And what's going to happen at the same time when I enable that feature is, how do I, in Kubernetes, get communication from my control plane VMs to my worker nodes? How I do that is I'm typically here talking to kubelet. So what's happening when we've enabled vSphere with Tanzu on this particular ESX cluster is we went in and we've added this special instance of this thing called Spherelet. What is Spherelet? It is our implementation of kubelet, and it runs directly on this ESX host as if you're familiar with a VIB, a VMware installation bundle. So it's actually running on the ESX host. What that gives us the ability to do is to directly run pods on this ESX host. So looking at the bigger architecture, what's going on inside here is this ESX cluster that I've enabled vSphere with Tanzu on. We're going to deploy a set of control plane VMs. These control plane VMs provide the API access for kubectl to come in. They in turn then, via the API server, are able to talk to Spherelet, which is our implementation of kubelet. And this is setting up the basic architecture for us to be able to run Kubernetes. Spherelet, as I said, is our natively ported kubelet to run on ESX iHost directly. It is the piece that is communicating with the control plane VM, so API server kubelet, now it's Spherelet talking back to it. Spherelet would manage the node configuration. If you think about if the control plane needs to talk to a worker node about doing something on that node, maybe mapping in a PVC, for example. That is actually communicated from the API server to kubelet. We're instead talking now to Spherelet. That would be that type of node configuration. It would also be something about saying, hey, worker node, start this pod. So if I'm saying start a pod, that goes from the API server via Spherelet, and in turn, we would be starting up a vSphere pod. Kubelet's always reporting back to the API server how many pods are running on that worker node. So that's the same functionality here. Okay, we've been going at this for a while. Let's go ahead and pause here. Let's go ahead and take a little bit of a break, stretch your legs, and come on back. And then I'm going to talk to you some more about this new exciting feature that we have when we're running vSphere with Tanzu, which is talking about the container runtime executive. All righty, I'll see you back soon.